What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are kind of doing the last of these series where I kind of go over some cards that are leaving standard. But today's video, we're going to be going over some of my favorite cards that are leaving standard. Now, while these cards are some cards that I enjoyed playing, not all these cards are really just, like super powerful or they saw a lot of play. In my personal opinion, a lot of these cards were more so cards that I enjoyed playing when I played them. They were a little bit more obscure in some regards, and some of them, had moments of where they were pretty popular in the meta as a whole. But over the course of the meta, they really, they either fell off or they really weren't super popular. While there's a couple of cards that you kind of see up here and there. So it's definitely an interesting list, I would say, none the least. And like I said, none of these cards are in any particular order, so the order that I ramble off of them really aren't in any particular order in like how, where I rank them overall in my top 10. But with that being said, with this list as well, it's definitely kind of one of those things that I just feel like, there's some cards leaving standard. I just feel like I talk about them a little bit before they leave, and possibly, down the road, maybe in the next couple weeks or so, I'll play some decks that maybe include these cards to kind of play them one last time before they kind of rotate out of standard. With that being said, let's just dive into the list and let's just start talking about it. So first and foremost, the one thing I want to kind of start out with is kind of some honorable mention cards that either they were of a certain mechanic or of a group of cards. I just really couldn't single it down to one particular card. So these like three cards that I'm going to be naming off are just kind of like there's a cluster of them, and I just, like I said, couldn't single out one, but I did enjoy the concept of what they brought when they did come to the format. And the first card up is going to be the Pathway lands. Now these lands are definitely unique in the sense that they're technically dual lands, but they're not dual lands in the traditional sense, as in the fact that you have to play one or the other side, but they produce one of two color mana. And it definitely made playing a lot of decks of various colors, of even possibly even 5 colors, a little bit more possible just because of the flexibility of these lands. The one thing I would say that's a little bit of a struggle with these lands is kind of understanding which lands you need and which lands you'll possibly draw sometimes, because sometimes you may put down one of these for like a green, and then you draw like the version that has like white green, but you don't need additional white mana, so you're left with double green. But overall, I feel like the pathways were kind of a cool concept of how to do a dual land without technically making it a land that produces both colors. And it definitely was kind of one of those things, like I said, just gave a lot of decks more flexibility. I will say, unless we get some new crazy lands, I would say playing decks of more than like 2 colors will be a little bit of a struggle because of a lot of lands that are currently in the format are on the slower side. Like they come in the battlefield tapped unless you hit a certain game state. So it will be kind of interesting to kind of see how these 3-color decks or more kind of work out without getting any sort of new land cycle in the near future. But like I said, we're still pre-Dominaria spoilers at the point of recording this video, so I may be saying that we're not going to get any dual lands that may help out with that situation. But as of right now, we really won't know until we really see those spoilers. So I will say a lot of decks will feel the pain of not having pathways, and losing them is kind of going to be a big deal for a lot of these decks that can be very aggressive by playing them. Now, the next cards up on this list are going to be the class cards that came from D&D, Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. I felt like they were an interesting concept. It's kind of like a saga, but instead of like a saga, things happen on certain turns. They were kind of like a mana sink, and each one of them brought something a little bit unique with the various classes that you could play. The Ranger class is probably the most popular, especially in mono green, just because it created a wolf token. Then the second thing that you invested with 2 mana would allow you to then, every time you attack, you get a +1/+1 counter target attacking creature you control. And then the last chapter was you kind of look at the top card of your library, and you get to play creatures off the top card of your library as if they were in your hand with the other one. So it's definitely, that was probably the most popular. I did enjoy playing some decks with Bard class. I thought Bard class playing like an all Legends deck was pretty cool because the Bard class essentially removed the red and green mana cost from a lot of Legends and essentially made the deck possible to play without basically having to pay the full mana, which was definitely pretty cool. And like I said, it was one of those things that you kind of saw when then they kind of like went it back and updated some of the classes for alchemy, that there was some potential in there, but I guess they maybe, nerfed them a little bit too hard, especially if they weren't the rare variety. They kind of buffed them a little bit to make them a little bit more playable. Like we saw buffs to Wizard class. I think we also saw a buff to the Druid class. Warlock class is another fun one that I enjoyed playing, like in the budget version of like a Rakdos Anvil deck. And there was probably a couple other classes that I feel like they saw play when they first got released, but then, nothing really happened with them. I think the Barbarian class is another interesting one that gave you more dice rolls, but, the dice roll mechanic kind of flopped, I would say, overall as a whole, because you really didn't see anyone really playing a dice roll deck for the most part, because it was more gimmicky than anything. You were just basing it all what your deck could do off of RNG. But I do think like cards like this, where you kind of invest, some of your mana into, are definitely cards I do enjoy playing, just because it gives you a bonus effect, even if you don't have anything to play, or they did something beneficial that kind of helped out your synergy of your deck overall as a whole. And I do think it's going to be one of those things that you'll kind of see. Not saying that these cards will be missed in a sense that because the decks will shift as the meta shifts, but I do think having cards that you can sink mana into when you didn't really have anything to do will definitely be cards that a lot of decks will feel the impact of. Though I will say there are a lot of sagas that are definitely really good, and I would say sagas could be a little bit better just because those are things that trigger each turn, and then especially if you play the ones from Kamigawa, they turn into creatures, which is a whole different thing. But definitely the classes were another group of cards that I do think are going to be missed, in a sense that just because they brought something unique to I guess the game state as an enchantment that you can invest into. And then the last cards up are going to be lesson cards. This is definitely a very interesting concept, and I think the reason why I think this will be missed is that this is kind of one of those things that with best of one, which is kind of primarily where I play a lot of my Magic currently, I guess. It's definitely one of those things that kind of helped out without being able to sideboard. These cards will allow you to kind of go into your sideboard, kind of pull out one of these lesson cards, and allow you to do various things, whether it was playing environmental sciences to kind of dig it through your deck, look for a basic land card, put it into your hand, and gain 2 life, which is definitely pretty important, I would say, in like a matchup where maybe you're playing against a very aggressive deck. That 2 life could matter. Hitting your land drop also matters. Then also maybe digging into your sideboard with the lesson card and looking for necrotic fumes, being able to exile target creature card. Going real big, getting the 7-drop lesson was definitely very good. Getting the one that gives target creature plus 2+1/+1 counters and vigilance at end of turn is good. These cards weren't really anything super powerful, but the lessons I felt like brought a unique, element to, I guess, gameplay overall. It's, like I said, especially in best of one. In best of 3, these cards probably didn't see as much play because they then competed with, spots in your sideboard, because they do take up sideboard slots. But, in a best of 1, this was kind of like a cool way that this is kind of how Wizards solved that, that not like really solved the problem with best of 1, but it kind of gave, a benefit to someone, wanting to play cards that kind of go into their sideboard to get a little bit more card advantage and possibly be able to pick out cards that kind of help them out, and depending on the situation. The other thing, too, that was definitely really cool that you never really saw anyone really do too much when it came to playing learn cards to get lessons was really to the draw a card and discard a card effect. But definitely, yet again, another cool effect with these lesson cards. If there was nothing that was really important they had left in your lesson board, you could always just draw and discard. But overall, yet again, another mechanic that I do think, in best of 1, you'll kind of miss just because it was kind of a mechanic that kind of helped you keep up, especially against those more aggressive opponents. Or maybe just if you just kind of drew a bad hand, this kind of helped maybe fix that hand just up a little bit. But yet again, I would say pretty important batch of cards in the last, standard, I would say, before they rotate. So going into my top 10, these are going to be cards that I do think I enjoyed playing in one way or the other, whether or not they were super powerful or overall dominant in the meta as a whole. These are just cards that I found like what they did to be pretty cool, or they had interesting mechanics. And the first card up is going to be Ascendant Spirit. Just kind of like class cards, this was another card that you invested snow mana into, and you can pump up the creature over time. This kind of reminds me, yet again, back in the day, I can't remember what set off the top of my head, but there was cards that you could like level up. And then, Ascendant Spirit essentially has that level up ability. This is, yet again, I think like another thing you could do with like, I think of like Figure of Destiny as another card that kind of like is an Ascendant Spirit, very cheap to initially cast, and then you invest mana into the creature, and the creature gets bigger and bigger over the course of time. This card definitely found a cool spot in like a Delver style or like a mono blue tempo deck, just because it gave you somewhere where to either, if your opponent really didn't do anything that you wanted to interact with, like with one of your counter spells, you can always invest that mana into your Ascendant Spirit, pump it up, and then kind of have a bigger and bigger creature until eventually got flying, and then eventually got additional +1/+1 counters, and then you drew a card every time you dealt damage with it. So I do think Ascendant Spirit is definitely a very diverse card in that sense that as much as it maybe didn't see like a lot of mainstream meta play, it was definitely still a very, very good card for what it did. And it just felt like in an environment where there's a lot more value in other cards, it did fall a little bit shy of being like a card you saw a lot of overall in the meta. Now, the next card up is a card I actually have mentioned before that I'm going to miss in Standard. And this is kind of more of a card that was definitely brought a different element to the game overall as a whole. And that card is going to be Finn, the Fang Bearer. Interesting 2-drop 1/3 green Death Touch creature that whenever one of your Death Touch creatures deal damage to an opponent, instead of doing normal, and on top of doing normal damage, it also dealt them poison damage, and if your opponent got to 10 poison, they lose the game. It just definitely brought a different element to the game. There was, back in the day, there's been Infect that kind of does the same thing, and this kind of just gives like a different element. Now, typically, most of the Death Touch creatures in Standard are very small creatures. They're 1/1s, or they're maybe like 2/2s or 1/2s with Death Touch. Nothing that your opponent's really going to be worried about attacking, but you start getting a board up of these little Death Touch creatures, and your opponent has to start throwing their creatures in front of them. And Death Touch creatures, the benefit of playing Death Touch creatures is that they, they can pretty much kill everything that they attack with, unless that creature has first strike or indestructible. A Death creature can trade with a much bigger creature, which was definitely kind of one of the benefit of playing like a Death Touch deck. And over the course of Standard, you definitely probably seen the occasional Death Touch deck, but yet again, not another mainstream meta deck overall. But yet again, it was a cool concept, just kind of playing something a little bit more off-key, different kind of win mechanic that you sometimes just wouldn't expect and be prepared for. So definitely kind of like one of those decks that I'll probably definitely dive into before it rotates. As there are a pretty decent handful of Death Touch cards that I feel like have better synergy now with this card. It's just unfortunate that some of these newer cards that get introduced are going to be staying in Standard, but unfortunately Fang the Fanbearer is going to be leaving, so the one downside of this card leaving, but still overall a cool card nonetheless. Now, the next card up on the list, as it was definitely a card I found a lot of enjoyment with. Maybe not as much in the current Standard, but definitely in the prior Standard before rotation from last year. And that card is going to be Sejmore Witch. She was a very interesting human warlock creature that whenever you casted a non-creature spell, you have to create a 1/1 pest creature token. And then when that creature dies, when that pest creature token dies, you gain 1 life. And the reason why I enjoyed playing this card is that there was like cool life gain. You gain life, you drain your opponent life whenever you gain life. This card definitely helped out with those kind of style of decks. Now there are still decks like that, but you're not really there's no card that really, like, whenever you gain life, your opponent loses life. But overall, she more so turned into like that card you may see in like the occasional control deck, because if you're playing a lot of non-creature spells to kind of to like counterbalance what your opponent's doing on the board state, Sejmore Witch would then start pumping out tokens that you can either use as chump blockers, or if they don't really have too many things on the battlefield, you can start attacking in with those chump blockers. And then if those chump blockers die, you gain some life. Definitely kind of a cool synergy with, like, say, like a Meat Hook Massacre. You get like a bunch of these out on the battlefield. You kind of wipe the board with the Meat Hook Massacre. Not only are you gaining life when your creatures are dying, your opponent's also draining for 1 point of life for each pest that would die in the process. Maybe at the same time too, their board would get wiped as well. But yet again, overall, she was a cool card. Like I said, very popular, I think, when she first released in the prior year Standard. More so than the current Standard, but still a card that I think had a cool concept. And it's definitely gonna be one of those things that not just this card with Magecraft, but there'll be other cards I think throughout Standard that had Magecraft that will be rotating. They will kind of miss in some way or another. Now the next card up is kind of like another card that I do think encompasses a lot of other cards, and that card's gonna be the Hobgoblin Bandit Lord. It's a 3-drop 2/3 Goblin Lord that essentially gives other goblins you control +1/+1, and then for 1 mana and tapping it, you can deal damage equal to the number of goblins that have entered the battlefield under our control this turn to any target. It was definitely a cool card in that it definitely gave goblins kind of a creature that kind of pumped up them. We did get a lot of other goblins from D&D D&D Forgotten Realms, not Baldur's Gate, though there are some of these goblins that got reprinted in Baldur's Gate. But yet again, goblins is going to be kind of missing a key piece even in like a post-standard alchemy, because Hobgoblin didn't get reprinted. But it's definitely a card, like I said, it made goblins that much better than they were, because typically goblins are a lot of smaller creatures. But when you played a good goblin deck, you were able to get out a lot of goblins pretty quickly, which got wide on your opponent. And then you kind of include this card, which then allowed your goblins to get that much bigger, which probably pushed you through to get enough damage through to kind of win the game. And the goblins deck, actually towards the tail end of our Standard that we're currently in, is still a fairly popular deck, still has a fairly good win rate in best of 1. I do think it's probably somewhere in the top like 5, maybe top 6. It's one of those decks that kind of fluctuates, from being like in the top 5 to out of the top 5. But overall, when we kind of lose a big chunk of our goblins come rotation, it's definitely one of those things you kind of miss, because especially older Magic players, I feel like older Magic players really love playing goblin decks. It's gonna be one of those things that when this goblin leaves, a lot of other goblins leave Standard, and you're gonna kind of miss playing goblins. You kind of be like, hopefully we get some more goblins in the future that we can go ahead and replay goblins in some form or capacity. But it will never be the same as how goblins were back when goblins were relevant in any meta. So it's definitely one of those things that you as a player may miss, especially if you are a goblin player and you do enjoy playing goblins. So the next card up on the list is going to be Fischl Retreat. Now this is another interesting card from Zendikar, that it was an enchantment that had landfall, that whenever we played a land card, we either give all our creatures +1/+1 and they gain vigilance, or we can create a 2/2 cat creature token. And this is kind of one of those cards that I think that, as it was kind of like a cool gimmicky kind of card, and I felt like a deck that played lands kind of came and went sometimes. There was always there was like a Selesnya deck that played this card, and then it kind of fell off a little bit, and then kind of towards the tail end, as we got the new fetches from Streets of New Capenna, the deck kind of popped up again. Yet again, another pretty cool card in the sense that it did a lot for just playing lands. And playing lands is like a thing that you hold priority on your turn, so you always kind of got a trigger unless your opponent had a response to the trigger. But overall, it was a cool card. It never really broke metas in that sense. But yet again, having an enchantment that gives you value over the course of the game, every time you just play a land, is definitely something that's pretty good, which then allows you to then do other things with your mana, pumping up your board, making your board pretty big and pretty wide on your opponent. I do think one of the reasons why this card probably wasn't as good as it could have been was things like Meathook Massacre turns all your creatures pretty much with tap in for 2x, or for 2 for the X. Essentially could wipe out your cat tokens if you weren't able to play an additional land to then pump them at least once. So overall, while a good card, there's definitely a lot of counters to this card. Vanish Inverse is another card I can talk off the top of my head. Invest in 4 mana, not having the mana to then play it afterwards, to then at least get one trigger out of it, and then having it only get Vanish Inverse is definitely another reason why I do think this card never saw super good success. But it saw some pretty decent success in the meta. I think there is a deck that's probably over 50% win rate currently in the meta that probably plays this card. But yet again, it's not at the same peak as some of the more popular meta decks that definitely have a higher overall win rate. And that's just because it unfortunately just wasn't able to really get going, just because of being having a lot of things that really just kind of counteract what you were trying to do with this card. Next card up is another interesting card, and it's kind of one of those things that was very surprising. That I'm actually like I said, I'm surprised that this card wasn't played a lot more than really it had been, and that is Teleportation Circle. So before rotation happened last year, we had a card, Yorion, the Sky Noodle. It was essentially a creature that came in the battlefield. It would phase, essentially exile cards from your side of the battlefield, and they return at the end of the turn back onto your battlefield. And it created this kind of interesting loop where you flicker things on and off the battlefield, get additional ETB effects when those things happened. This card's a little bit cheaper at being a 4 mana, though it's also an enchantment. It is monocolored compared to Yorion, which was dual colored. I guess so. I guess just like Fischl Retreat, this is another enchantment that if you could get it to stick and you're putting into play cards like Vanish Inverse or had some other way to interact with it, you definitely could get a lot of value with this card. I just do think it was just kind of hard to play a card that was kind of expensive that your opponent could just kind of Vanish Inverse, because you could play it and you don't even get to the end of your turn. Your opponent just Vanish Inverses it. You don't get the trigger. You just wasted spending 4 mana. But yet again, another cool card that had an interesting idea. People do enjoy like playing decks that kind of flicker things on and off the battlefield to get extra value out of things. Like I said, it just, I guess, didn't culminate into having some sort of dominance in the meta or really big prominence. I do think there's another deck like a Selesnya and Flicker, like Teleportation Circle kind of deck that probably exists currently in Standard. Maybe over 50%. I'd have to double check. I know I saw one pop up, I think, right around the time of Streets of New Capenna, though it's been a while since I checked in on it. But yet again, another cool card that I feel like is a cool gimmicky card, but definitely a card that can definitely be really good. I guess, unfortunately, it just didn't work out in the current meta as a whole to see a lot more play than it really did. Now, the next card up is another card that I felt like a lot of people tried to make work and just couldn't make work, and that card's going to be Demilich. It's a 4 mana, 4/3 that every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, it costs 1 blue less to cast. And then whenever it attacks, you can exile to 1 target instant or sorcery card from a graveyard. You can copy it and then cast that spell, so you have to pay the mana to then cast that spell. But definitely another interesting card. It seems really good on paper. You're like, oh, a card that can make cost blue less every time I cast instant or sorcery, so you can play things like Consider and things like that, and then maybe get it out for free or get it out for cheaper and still get value out of the other cards you are playing. But yet again, it's another one of those cards I felt like, had a lot of potential. It's just the way the meta is and, what you have to do to really get it out on the battlefield for a more effective casting rate. It just didn't really compete with other decks of the meta. It's definitely one of those things that I like I said, when it first released, I felt like a lot of people tried to make it work. It was just really hard to make a 4 blue creature work that was only a 4/3 that really didn't actually have a lot of effect until it attacks, so it was definitely very vulnerable the turn after it came out. It does have a secondary effect too that you could actually, do an additional effect with. By, you can cast Demilich from the graveyard by exiling 4 instant or sorcery cards from a graveyard in addition to paying its other costs, so you still have to pay the 4 mana unless you made that cheaper by putting those cards in the graveyard. But, it's definitely a card that I feel like many people tried to crack. Unfortunately, weren't able to really crack and make it put it into a deck in an effective way. I think it popped up here and there in certain like Is It decks or maybe like a mono blue deck, but it just never really got itself out of like kind of being in the experimental area for the most part. But overall, like I said, definitely another cool card. It just couldn't compete with a lot of the other big cards of the format, I guess, as it kind of existed in the current meta. Now, the next card up on the list is going to be Tosky, the Bearer of Secrets. Now, it's a 4-mana 1/1 squirrel, and a weird part because of some of the decks I may have played in the past. I do enjoy squirrel cards that get added into Magic. Back in the day, I was a big fan of playing like a deck called like Squirrel Opposition, which was a pretty cool deck where you make squirrel tokens that tap down your opponent, and that was kind of like one of my favorite decks that I've always played. And ever since then, I've really held like every time they print like a squirrel card into Magic, I enjoy that. And this card is definitely a pretty good card. It was definitely a card that saw a lot of prominence, I think, early on in like the mono green decks. I would say maybe early on, even in this current rotation that we're in. But it definitely fell off just because I guess there was better cards in that 4-drop slot that you could definitely play. Seeker's Chariot's definitely one of those cards that rings a bell. But the card is definitely really good. It's definitely a card that it doesn't seem really great when you look at it. It's being a 4-mana 1/1. It can't be countered. It's indestructible. And then it attacks each turn if able, and then whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. So overall, that does seem very good. But yet again, it's a card that doesn't work well in a meta that has like cards like Meathook Massacre. It's a card that gets around that the indestructibility by giving it -X/-X. If you're able to line this up pretty decently with like a Rangers class, it was definitely a card that you could get going. But if you're playing against an opponent that, like I said, played the Meathook Massacre, there was no way of getting this thing really off the ground unless your opponent just didn't have the Meathook Massacre in their hand. But yet again, good card on paper. I think this card definitely didn't get as much playtime as it probably deserved, just because having cards like Meathook just kind of killed what this card could do as a whole, especially in like those mono green decks or these other aggressive decks of the format. Another next card up on the list is another interesting card that came out of the D&D Adventure of the Forgotten Realms. And I actually, now looking at this, there's a lot of cards I guess I have in my collection that come out of this set, and also Call Time for the most part. But this card was definitely very interesting. It's Inferno of the Star Mountains. It's a 6-mana 6/6 that can't be countered. It has flying and haste. And it essentially has like a Shivian Dragon ability that you can tap a red, and it gets +1/+0 into end of turn. And when its power becomes 20 this way, it deals 20 damage to any target. Now that ability is more of a far-fetched thing, unless you have a way to generate almost like infinite amount of mana, or you have like Goldspan Dragon or something like that to create a bunch of treasure tokens to then tap them, break them for 2 mana apiece, and then pump it out. It was definitely an interesting card. It definitely seems very solid. Yet again, having a 6-mana 6/6 that can attack the turn it comes into the battlefield. And on top of that, if you have any extra mana left over, you can then put that additional mana into it to make it that much bigger. It's kind of like, it kind of seems like cards that seem like they would be good in a standard just aren't as good as they used to be. I think this card kind of reminds me of when they reprinted Baneslayer Angel. It was really a good card when they first printed it the first time, but when they reprinted it, it just wasn't as good, just because it just didn't do enough to compete with cards that have a lot of ETB effects or have a lot more value than it just being a very, very big creature that can attack really, can attack the turn it comes out. But overall, it's just a card that, like I said, it kind of reminds me of Shivian Dragon kind of on steroids, in the sense that it can attack the turn it comes in. It has a cool effect if you can really get it that high. I mean, granted, you're probably never going to get it that high, and like I said, unless you have some crazy infinite mana combo, or just can create a lot of mana before it comes out. But yet again, a cool card. Just unfortunate it just didn't see as much play as I hoped it did. I actually think all the dragons that came up from D&D Baldur's Gate, I keep on saying Baldur's Gate, Adventure of the Forgotten Realms, they had some interesting concepts, but unfortunately they just weren't good enough to compete with other cards around them in the current meta or standard, especially with them being a little bit more on the expensive side. Definitely kind of wish these cards played out a little bit differently overall in the meta. And this is kind of the one, at least my favorite of the dragons, that, just I wish it saw a little bit, just that little bit more play, I think, in a meta that we have. Now, the last card up on the list is kind of like more controversial card, in the sense that I feel like there's a lot of people who love this card, and there's a lot of people who also hate this card. And that card's gonna be Kibble or Valky God of Lies. You know, it's definitely an interesting card, and it's a planeswalker that's on one side. It's a creature that's a 2/1 that gets to look at an opponent's hand, take a creature they control from their hand, put it underneath it, and then you can pay X mana, and Valky becomes a copy of that card. And then on the flip side, it is a planeswalker, so it's definitely a multi-use card in the early game and the late game. It's a 7-drop planeswalker with 5 loyalty. It has a +2 that you exile top card of each player's library, a -3 exile target artifact or creature, and then -8 you exile all graveyards and add mana to your add 4 red mana to your mana pool, which essentially allows you to possibly cast some of those cards that you exiled. And then on top of that, you got an emblem that whenever you exile a card with Valky, you can play those exiled cards and you can pay any mana to cast those spells. So all in all, it was definitely a very, very, very powerful card. I thought it was a very cool planeswalker. You know, it is on the expensive side, so it's not something you can see on like turn 4, turn 5. You've seen it pop up a lot, you know, in decks. I'm not saying it was like it's probably like the middle range of planeswalkers currently in the meta. You know, it's not, you know, as I would say, it's not as popular as say like a Lolth. I guess the Wandering Emperor is another popular planeswalker that currently is around. You see Sorin around a lot. But I think Tybalt's up there as being one of the more popular planeswalkers, especially from Kaldheim. You know, it's still a good planeswalker. It does a lot of good things. It's definitely great in control decks where you can kind of keep board state control, kind of help, you know, protect Valky in that sense. But definitely a cool card that, you know, it's just unfortunate that it's kind of rotating out just because it's definitely one of those planeswalkers that if you look and play like a mono black control deck with a splash of red just to play Tybalt, it's definitely one of those cards I do think you'll miss in like the 2-drop slot just because it did a lot of things that could help you out in the early game as well as, you know, help you finish off your opponent in the late game. But overall, you know, it's definitely a card that I'm going to miss. And just like every card on this list, it's definitely a lot of cards that I do think, you know, they're cool in concept. It's definitely, you know, as cards rotate out of standard, you know, they go into other formats. Like they technically can still be played. But a lot of times with a lot of these cards, when they move and rotate into other formats, they're just, you know, they're not as good as they once were, or you can't recreate, you know, certain moments that you were able to create when they were standard legal, just because I do think when you move into the more eternal formats that don't have any rotation, cards kind of lose a little bit of power just because the card pool of good cards kind of is kind of like here. And if the card wasn't in that card of good cards, those cards that were like in the middle kind of are more on the bad card side of everything. And like I said, you know, it's definitely one of those things, like this list could vary depending on, you know, who you talk to, you know, what kind of decks they play. I would say my list, I try to be a little bit diverse with my list, to have a little bit of here and there. You know, there's some cards I probably didn't even have on the list that I do think, you know, I personally didn't play a lot of. I think like Tier Grid's one of them that was on the list that people have on their list as a card they really, really liked. I didn't personally play a lot of Tier Grid decks, but definitely, you know, another cool card that I do think people will miss when it rotates out, as much as it wasn't maybe a popular standard card. But overall, you know, like I said, if you guys have any cards that you think that that you enjoy, that you'll be leaving in standard that you're going to miss a little bit, if whether or not you play decks around them or just because of what the card was, let me know in the comments below. I'd definitely like to hear what you guys think. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one, hit that subscribe button. It definitely helps out a lot. And if you like the video, hit that like button. It also lets me know you guys like these style of videos. And with that being said, guys, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.